Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. For more than 26 years, this TV series has explored issues related to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. Decades ago, I was talking with an elderly friend who had escaped from Germany during the late 1930s, when the Nazis were reported to be doing horrible things. He told me that before he left, his friends there told him they could not believe that Germany could do the horrible things that some people said that the new Nazi government was doing. His friends said that Germany was a nation of musicians, scientists, artists, philosophers, and theologians, so they could not believe what people were telling them that the German government and the German people were doing. Human beings have psychological defense mechanisms that make it hard for us to accept hard realities. In fact, Al Gore titled his movie about the climate crisis An Inconvenient Truth. The climate crisis is only one of the hard realities that many people deny rather than grapple with honestly. Likewise, the pervasive danger of nuclear war that could destroy life on Earth any minute is too unpleasant to think about. So most Americans try to ignore the danger that nuclear weapons threaten every minute of the day. Americans, and especially politicians, like to say that we have the world's best democracy, when actually we have one of the lowest rates of voter turnout and an election system that is horribly corrupted by multi-millionaires and giant corporations. And the U.S. military has actually overthrown democracies and replaced them with brutal dictators in many parts of the world since the 1950s. These are objective facts that very few American politicians or mainstream media will admit, and that most Americans do not want to know about. So we, like the Germans of the 1930s, find it hard to accept hard realities that contradict the comfortable self-image that we enjoy. During this TV program, we'll consider some practical, psychological, and spiritual consequences of denying these hard realities. We'll connect the dots between various issues and various parts of our lives, and we'll consider some remedies to help us accept reality and solve the problems. Our intention is not to blame, but to help us understand and move ahead towards solutions. I'm happy to welcome three guests whom I respect deeply for their wisdom and their insights. They will help us think meaningfully about the hard issues about which our nation is in denial and about the psychological and spiritual consequences of that denial. John Van Enwyck is an Episcopal priest, a PhD clinical psychologist, and clinical director of the International Trauma Treatment Program. He has special insights and skills to help people deal with severe trauma, such as war and torture. Good to have you here, John.
Thank you, Glenn.
Debbie Eden has been a teacher and youth worker. For 11 years, she was a trainer and volunteer coordinator for our local hospice program. Since 1990, she has worked with Heartsparkle Players, a playback theater troupe based in Olympia that helps people tell their stories of life experiences. Good to have you here, Debbie.
Thank you.
And Arthur Vaney has long served as minister of the Olympia Unitarian Universalist congregation. He and the congregation engage the community in thinking and taking positive action in the world around us. Good to have you here, Arthur.
Thank you.
So we will have an interesting time. My introduction to the program here mentioned the climate crisis, nuclear weapons, and democracy. What else would you like to say about the widespread denial about any of these hard realities of climate, nuclear weapons, or democracy? And we'll get into more issues later. But anything that you want to share about those offhand?
I think one thing we want to talk about is the impotence of the American electorate and the degree to which people are not recognizing that. That in fact, the American people have little or no control over what legislation is passed in the Congress.
And that's a hard thing to...
It's a hard thing to recognize.
Yeah. And when we were preparing for the TV program, both Arthur and John mentioned American exceptionalism. And that's another whole area of in which people are in denial. Would either of you describe what American exceptionalism means?
Sure. Yeah, my understanding is that it originated back at the country's formation, essentially, when de Tocqueville, a French political philosopher who came and toured the U.S., and he made a declaration that America was an exceptional country and that it was the first, as I understand it, it was the first, among the first to have a revolution and to be a democracy. And so in that sense, it was exceptional. And there was a sense of it being sort of being a light to the world in terms of that. But since then, that understanding has shifted, and particularly today, among a certain segment of American population, there's an understanding that American exceptionalism indicates that we're better and that we don't have to abide by the same rules as other nations and other people.
When we were talking on the phone to prepare for this, you referred to American exceptionalism also, and you called it a great setup for disaster.
Yes, yes.
Which I thought was a pretty heavy term. Tell us what you meant.
Well, if American exceptionalism means that we have the best educational system, we have the best healthcare system, we have the strongest military, we can enforce our well-meaning will on the rest of the world to their own advantage, the only place we can go from there is to recognize that it's not the case, that our healthcare system is not the top, our educational system is very good, but slipping dramatically, and that our military in the last 4 years has not been able to accomplish its objectives in the last 4 wars.
Yeah.
So that's a real blow to people who need to think that we are actually the best.
Yeah. It makes me think about, in the Greek tragedies, there's this recurring pattern in these Greek tragedies where you have the hero who overreaches, and because of hubris, the Greek term for this arrogance, ends up with a downfall.
Absolutely.
And you look at the U.S. In the world, and I think there are a lot of people not rooting for us because of these decades of hubris.
Sure.
So, do any of you see also an unspoken sense of loss about even having a future? And that's another sort of a thing that people are in denial about, but I keep seeing evidence, and one or more of you, when we were preparing for the program, talked about some things that might indicate people's sense of loss of having a future.
Well, I think the whole notion of denial relates to the fear of lack of future and the inability to acknowledge that we have some significant difficulties. So when we are unable to acknowledge that there are difficulties in our society, then there's a part of us that's missing, that there's a part of us that's unable to participate in creating a whole society. And that leads to, from my perspective, a loss of perspective in terms of being able to go forward, in terms of seeing a healthy future for our country and for ourselves.
For many years now, a couple of decades actually, the number one mental illness among people who are diagnosed as mentally ill in the United States is anxiety disorder. So somewhere in the neighborhood of 1/3 of all people who feel that they are suffering from mental illness are suffering from anxiety. Anxiety means that something's not right, something's not going well, that there's a potential threat on the horizon that is usually not identified. If it's identified, we call it fear. Anxiety is fear without an object. So this is a real indication that there's something going on in our culture that people are beginning to be aware of that is disturbing them heavily. And among my colleagues here in Olympia, one of the things we've seen in our own practices is an uptick in paranoia, which is, again, another indication that people are aware of something that is a threat to them, but not necessarily know what it is.
Or misplacing it, misplacing the
Well, it's
cause?
so, absolutely. I mean, if you have the fear of something or the anxiety that there's a threat, and you have managed to divorce yourself from what the actual threats are, you will assign those threats to other people. It's that group over there. Oh, it's those people there.
Yeah.
These people here are trying to, and so it leads to a lot of polarization.
Yeah. And
a lot of
scapegoating. We see scapegoating in
Absolutely.
political campaigns and
Sure,
many-
without any really reason to know why.
yeah.
So it's a very kind of abstruse phenomenon.
Are there other examples of evidence that we see about these sort of these free-floating, denial about hard realities, but it comes out into sort of free-floating who knows what?
Well, I think I mean some of the issues that we'll be talking about, the emphasis on on gun ownership speaks to me about an underlying sense of fear that that to imagine that we need to have guns in every household for us to be safe speaks to me about a fear that is unspoken, and that we. I mean, we like to imagine ourselves as being an open and welcoming people, and yet when we have this conception that that gun ownership is essential to our well-being as a society, then that comes, I believe, from a place of deep fear.
I keep seeing folks who maybe in their mid-30s, where traditionally, by that time people have kind of settled in, gotten a career going, maybe gotten a family, maybe bought a house, and we got a lot of people like in their 30s who have not done any of that. There's this, I think there's a sense of loss of the American dream, and it's not something that people can acknowledge out loud because everybody wants to believe in the American dream, and yet for a lot of people that career, home ownership, family stuff isn't happening, and as a society I think we haven't grappled with that either. Is another.
Yes, in every developing country in the world, the birth rate is down dramatically, to the degree that in some cultures the birth rate is less than a death rate. So the actual population is declining, except for immigration, which then tends to inflate the statistics. But the fact of the matter is people are either delaying marriage, and many people are deciding not to have children. They will be candid. I've talked to many of them, I'm sure all of us here have, and they will say, I don't want to bring children into this world. I don't know if there's a future. That's a real sign of anxiety, a real sign of that something is desperately wrong, but it's very difficult for people to kind of get a sense of what it is, and even worse, to know what to do about it.
Do you?
Well, I'm actually thinking about my own daughter who's 36 years old, and the people with which she, she's grown up with, and the lives that they've led, and in terms of, the folks who are her friends who are doing well are actually people who tend to be quite wealthy, tend to have moved into careers where they're going to have a fair amount of money, the medical career, doctors, that sort of thing. And they're making choices about having families and that sort of thing. And then there's some of her peers who are like herself who haven't moved into that kind of higher status, and they're looking around and going, how will I make it? How will I, she's going to graduate school now thinking that is what's going to help her be able to get that and be, a productive member of society and do good work and that sort of thing. But there is this sense of young people feeling that where am I going to have this? Will I have, will I be able to own a home? Will I be able to have a career that will support me? And what does that mean, like you're saying, in terms of what is the future of what we want for the folks who live in this country? All the folks, not just people who have wealth, not just people who have advanced educations and are able to move into those, status jobs.
Yeah, I certainly see that with some of our young adults in the congregation I serve, where it's always difficult, I believe, moving for those who go to college, who have that opportunity, and then that transition into their work life, and it's just really difficult at this time. That they seem to be struggling to a far greater extent even than past generations.
And the part of the sense of the program topic that we have isn't just we have problems in our society, but that we're not really dealing honestly with those problems. We're not grappling them. We're not naming them. We're not putting them out there. There's a lot of denial. And so, as one of you had mentioned to me on the phone when we were doing the preparation, that if you're not making it, it must be your own fault. Or the scapegoating, the paranoia, or
somebody else is to blame.
There's something,
Right.
and there seems to be a denial of looking at the systemic problem, or just and so it's like maybe I'm the only one that's having difficulty getting out of adolescence and into an adult life, But no, you're not the only one. It's pervasive. And as a society, it just seems like we need to deal with this. And one of the elements of denial that I see is that we have giant corporations and media who are spending many millions of dollars promoting denial of climate change or promoting denial of what life is all about, when really what they're selling is cars or beer or whatever it is. So we have huge economic forces that are shaping our culture and what our culture believes is important or real, and a lot of that is a sham. And so I think that's got to be undermining the society as well and fostering denial.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the things that we discussed was that there seems to be this could just be my insane psychotic fantasy, but there seems to be a real movement out there among those who have to grab as much as they possibly can while there's still time. And it's almost an open admission that things are beginning to fray, kind of come apart at the seams, and they are going to also do everything they can to make sure that the rest of the population does not realize this, does not become aware of it. And when we have a media in the country where the vast majority of media outlets are in the hands of 3 corporations, and all of those corporations have a vested interest in their profit and in telling people what will get them to buy products from those corporations, we have a denial system built in to the very media in the country. And the problem with that, of course, is that if we are in denial, we are in denial of something. So we all are in denial, and sometimes we're not even aware of what it is, but we know that there's something that we need to be concerned about, and we're trying to find out what it is. We're a country of 300 million people. Hard to get some consensus in a country of 300 million people.
Yeah. Why does denial occur? Maybe we've touched on this already, but is there anything else we want to say about why denial occurs? Why do individuals or entire society try to deny the existence of hard realities? Maybe that's obvious.
Well, of course, denial does serve us in small portions, but when it becomes a way of life, then as we're indicating, it becomes destructive. But why would we? Well, we have a mythology about ourselves. We have particular ways that we need to, or we believe we need to understand ourselves. And I believe that that part of this understanding of American exceptionalism, part of our mythology about this being a country where anyone can make it if they try hard enough, that it makes it very difficult to acknowledge that that we do have problems, and that there are things that we that either we do that are harmful or that are harming us. That that we should be able to overcome that.
Yeah. Debbie, you had something to
Well, I was
add?
just thinking it's very layered in terms of, like you were saying, denial does serve somewhat of a purpose in human beings. I mean, for us to get in a huge hunk of metal and hurl ourselves down an interstate with all these people that we have no idea what condition they might be in these huge, hunks of metal, we have to be in a certain amount of denial, so to speak.
Sure.
We have to believe that we are in command of this hunk of metal, and we're going to get where we need to go. So, as and especially in the modern day, there are many things we have to kind of, push aside so we can keep going. And I think about this in the work that I did with hospice, which is, people are actually have a hospice diagnosis. They've been diagnosed as terminally ill, and they choose not to dwell there. And so all the things that they might do to be able to prepare themselves and their loved ones, or have conversations, or do any number of things that might be helpful to them, they choose not to do that. I think in some of these instances, some of the ways in which we deny things, it's like this human psyche, it's like if we took it all in its enormity, it is very difficult for us to hold it. Some of us have an easier task than others to do that. Some of us have a greater capacity to hold contradiction and complexity and all that, and others of us, it's overwhelming. And so I think there is this way in which we live in the land of denial, or I would also say, which is a word you didn't use, escape. You didn't use the fact that we haven't used that word, and I think much of the media, some of what we get given. I had a man come and say to me, wouldn't you like to have 150 channels of television? And I was like, no, I don't want 150 channels of television. Not to say anything bad about television, but I'm just saying,
No, that's fine. Go right ahead.
I'm just saying that is a way to, perhaps it's aid our denial, to escape, to take us, to allow us to escape. You talked about materialism. And so I guess I'm just thinking it's so layered, this idea of denial and how we use it and why we use it.
Just to interrupt, and I think what both of you are kind of getting at also is the amazing amount of complexity in all of this, that we all feel that there's not much we can actually do. So if there's nothing we can do, then the best alternative is to just ignore the problem. And I think we're going to get into that. What can we do? And I think, Art, you'll have some really good stuff to tell us about that. But,
Well, I think that this overwhelming sense of powerlessness is in the work that I do as a volunteer to organize people, get people involved in working for peace, social justice, take care of the climate, do all these things. A lot of people, we have a lot of volunteers, but I think the general public feels like they're powerless, they can't do anything. And much of the task that I see that we have to do as grassroots organizers is to help people find things that they can do that actually will have some strategic advantage so that we are not powerless. But the system keeps trying to tell us that we're powerless.
Absolutely.
And as one of you mentioned on the phone when we were doing the preparation after 9/11 occurred in 2001, George W. Bush told us to just go out and go shopping. Let him and Dick Cheney run a war. We don't have any voice in whether to have a war or not. Our role is go out and go shopping.
Bye.
Ooh, what does that say about democracy? There are some practical aspects of denial, as you said. It can shield us from an overwhelming complexity, but there are some practical aspects that I think are practical consequences. I think that are not so good. One is if we're in denial about a problem, then we're not going to be solving it. So one of the consequences of excessive denial is problems go unsolved. And that's true in any of these big issues that we care about.
Yeah, well, and of course, I mean, never mind solving it. If it's just unrecognized, then we can we get blindsided by it time and again, and so it gets exacerbated by the fact that we're just unable to recognize it. And, solving problems is I mean, that's extraordinary when that happens.
Yeah.
But just to recognize it and recognize that there is a problem and that there's something amiss here in our lives, and to be able to acknowledge that and to be with it. I mean, that's enriching in and of itself.
Yes. One of the basic functions of, I think, a healthy psychology and a healthy spirituality is a recognition of reality. And if we're in denial, we're not connecting ourselves with reality. I want to check in with us about what some of the psychological aspects are, some of the psychological consequences of denial. We've talked about some, but one, I think, is that it frustrates this natural human urge to have a realistic outlook on life, or a connection. Other psychological consequences of denial?
Sure. And exceptionalism is a great place to start, because exceptionalism says we really are the best, therefore everybody should listen to us. And we don't really need to listen to anybody else because we're the top, so why would we listen to anybody else? So we deny ourselves all kinds of positive input that we might have to solving questions. That's the first thing. The other thing with exceptionalism is, if I am part of an exceptional society, I myself must be exceptional. Therefore, I don't really need to compromise my lifestyle in any way to address any of these larger questions. So, for example, global warming. There's no reason why I should have to turn off my engine when I'm reading my mail at the post office. That's ridiculous. I have a right. I paid for this car. I bought this gasoline. This is mine. This is the greatest country on earth. Why do I need to do this? And meanwhile, CO2 is pumping into the atmosphere and causing more global warming. We're contributing to the problem. And it's a form of denial that comes out of a right to not have to deal with.
Yeah.
So part of the denial we're dealing with is, like Debbie's talking about, escape. The other is, I don't have to. It's not my problem. They'll solve it. Not my problem. I think that's one of the psychological problems here, is that we deny ourselves all kinds of community interaction that can actually, as a group, move us forward.
Right.
Well, that's what I was going to say, that I think the other thing that happens is sort of an isolation that can happen to individuals in getting overwhelmed, or in trying to keep it, all these things that we're talking about at bay. Then people can become very isolated, and they may do it through escapism, but they also may do it, and I was thinking more of like the spiritual aspect of what happens to one's soul, if you will, however you want to define that, when you are isolated and afraid and not connected to the reality of what is actually happening, and then being in communion with others to be able to do something. That we humans are meant to be together and work together and do things together. But if we're, isolated and pushing that all away, we suffer. We suffer greatly.
Yeah. Other psychological or getting into the spiritual consequences, either way? Because we'll talk about spiritual next, but if there's anything else on the psychological consequences of denial, let's
Well, we've covered the bases. We've got paranoia, we've got anxiety, we've got lack of community, which is actually moving into the spiritual realm. But yeah, the whole idea of denial, basically there's something there we have to deal with. We have no idea what it is. We don't really want to know what it is, but it's there every day of our lives, every minute of our lives, and it's making us miserable. That's a psychological problem.
And I think that somehow deep down people sort of know that we're doing that.
Yeah.
And
Sure.
the knowledge that we're failing to rise to the occasion also cycles back in further pain.
Right. And this is
I think it hurts to be in denial.
Absolutely. This is why Art was saying the first thing is to make people aware of the fact that we're in denial.
Yes.
Most of us who are in denial, we don't know we're in denial.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's very convenient.
So what about some spiritual aspects? Two of you folks are ordained, and all of us have hearts. So any of you?
Yeah,
have
well, if
something
I'm
to say?
ordained, I must know the answer.
Yeah, well, that's
right.
That's why we brought you out to the show and pay you the big bucks, which is zero.
Thank you.
Oh, really?
Same as the crew, the volunteer crew and I get. So
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think my sense is that whenever we deny any part of our humanity, then we become less human. I mean, by definition, those parts of us that we alienate that we're unable to access, then we become less, and we become entities unto ourselves. And as Debbie said, we are inherently relational beings. That we have this understanding of ourselves as individual beings, and on some level, of course, obviously we are. We're here as four separate, in one sense, beings, and yet we're inherently relational. We have a need to be with other people. It's quite exceptional. When somebody goes off to be a hermit, it is not exceptional when someone chooses to live in society, because that's the norm. That is the way that we're wired to be, the way that we essentially are. And so when we deny, we are leaving out parts of who we are, and that means parts of our capacity to be in relationship, and to even with those things that we're uncomfortable with about ourselves and about our society, when we're able to acknowledge them, then that is an invitation to be in relationship.
I think of two other spiritual connections. One, there's a biblical quotation that says that you should seek the truth will set you free. Mm-hmm. If we're in denial, we are denying going after the truth, denying seeking the truth. And if we don't have that truth, then we're not set free. So I think denial, violates that biblical encouragement. Another thing that comes to mind is there's in a liturgical church, there's a part of the service that involves the confession of sins, and then there's forgiveness, and then you can move on after that with a new sense of proceeding with our lives. If we're in denial about something and we can't, not necessarily confess our sins, but at least can't even recognize the realities, can't acknowledge what's real, it sort of inhibits us. And it would be like for a liturgical church or a liturgical kind of a spiritual practice, you're not flowing through the process, and there's a blockage there. There's an absence of something that seems to be crucial for moving on with our lives.
Yeah, I think that's one thing religion's got right. That we do need to be able to acknowledge what's wrong with our in our lives, and when we do need to be able to hold that up, and that it does, as we're just saying. It does stifle us as human beings when we're unable to acknowledge either what we have done wrong or just what is wrong with life.
Yeah. You had something, John?
Yes, I think that as you were saying about confession, it's very difficult to move on from something that we don't acknowledge, that we don't know is there to begin with. But the other thing too is that one of the difficulties religion has is that no one has seen God, but we always see the hand of God in the creation. And we know that the natural order is given to us. We can't create food. We can plant seeds, we can water them, we can cover them with pesticides and fertilizers, but they may not grow. It's all just a kind of a gift to us that food grows. And when we destroy that, either through nuclear war or through climate change, or through shooting each other up with guns, or any of these things we're talking about, the guilt and shame that we incur as a result of trashing the very things that are given to us makes us feel terrible, makes us feel guilty, makes us feel shameful, which again then moves into the psychological perspective of, well, somebody else must be to blame for that. That's a very difficult situation.
Well, even going back to the creation story, where it says that God created this wonderful environment and it was good.
Yes.
And so what do we do? What happens when we have various kinds of economic and other pressures that mess the climate up,
right?
Or the environment, or each other as part of the creation? There's something that's interfering with a larger scheme of things,
right?
And that's got to be causing anxiety and everything else, because somehow we know that we're screwing up with
it's also
the
crushing to the spirit.
Yeah,
it's crushing to the spirit.
Yeah. Yeah.
I also think that there's a way in which we become conflicted internally that is sometimes difficult for us to deal with and name. And I'm thinking about an example. I had a discussion with a gentleman yesterday, and we were talking about folks panhandling, homeless folks downtown Olympia. And I said to him, I said, so why do you think people don't like that, you know? Because we were talking about it, and he goes, well, people just don't want to be hassled. You know, people just want to walk down the sidewalk and not be hassled, you know? And I said, one thing I think is that I think people don't want to deal with their conflicted feelings about seeing someone on the street who has less than them, probably a whole lot less than them, and is asking something of them. And you know, and I think part of our denial is not wanting to name that conflicting feeling that we have about our belief in exceptionalism, or our right to have, or just the fact that we do have a home to go to. And I think people want that. I think we want those things to be put somewhere so we don't have to see that.
Right.
You know, I think there's that, and I think of that as psychological, but also spiritual.
Yeah, I do too. In the early 70s, I worked 2 years for the DSHS Public Assistance Office, a local office. And what became really clear to me back in the early 70s was that the system had all kinds of insults and humiliations built into it to punish people for being poor. The different aspects of the regulations and how they're treated and a whole bunch of different things, I think were perhaps subconsciously built into the welfare system in order to humiliate and punish people for being poor, in order that those of us who were not poor could have somebody to look down on, and rather than ask questions, hard questions, about why is it that there's so much poverty in the richest country on earth. There was no encouragement to ask the hard economic and social justice questions. It was all about, no, there's somebody below me that I can dump on and humiliate with these procedures and the treatment that they were getting. And my role as an employee there, I consciously connected humanely and respectfully with people, and the clients really would rather connect with me if they had to come to the office than with a lot of the other coworkers, because they didn't get a bunch of crap from me, and I would try to find some way to meet their needs anyway. But there was denial about systemic economic and social injustice built into the system, and I recognized that back in 40 years ago. So I think there's a lot of what you're saying, and it comes out at the institutional level as well, in probably
As well
other
as on the
systems as well.
sidewalks, yeah.
Yeah, it's in the sidewalks, and it's in the welfare offices, and it's in the political campaigns, and it's pervasive. But we don't want to look there, just like you say. Is there anything else we want to say about any of the big issues that we mentioned at the beginning of the program, like climate, nuclear weapons, U.S. empire, American exceptionalism, any of these kinds of things, or any of the other kinds of things that are elements about which we're in denial? We've covered a lot of stuff. I just want to see if there's an opportunity to add to anything, maybe connect some dots. Or.
Well, the climate change is such a significant one, because there's no escaping that for any of us. And as I think we had said earlier, you may have made reference to the role of corporations and in terms of promoting a sense of promoting climate change denial, but a sense that that either there isn't climate change, or if there is, it's not created by us.
It's not my fault. Somebody
else. It isn't us.
Nature did it or something.
Yeah.
Sunspots. Who knows?
And this is such a big one. I mean, it is. We have seen. While certainly you want to be careful about not attributing any particular weather events to climate change, because weather is weird all the time, or can be. Wherever I have lived in the country, people have said, if you don't like the weather, wait a minute, and it'll be different. And folks seem to think that's true, and it is true wherever we live. But this is something that that has the potential of destroying our not just our way of life, but much of life, and is destroying much of life. Even now, there are species that are being exterminated, and that's very frightening. Very frightening to confront and to acknowledge, and very hard to get a handle on about what can I do. And any one of our individual actions, as John said, we may turn our car off, and that's a good thing to do, but it doesn't amount to that much, and so it's that sense of helplessness in the face of this this huge catastrophe, and so there's good reason to be in denial on the one hand, that
Right.
What in the world do we do, but on the other, it just points to all the more to our need to be to begin to be in ongoing conversation about this, and about any of these issues that that we see, but climate change is, as I say, is just so huge.
I think one other element that as long as you opened up that can of worms of what else are we in denial about, is the futility of a consumer-based economy, consumption-based economy. I think one of the things that we're beginning to realize is our economy cannot just continue to grow. There's not the money to keep it growing, and the idea that so many of our jobs depend on people buying stuff, and people buying stuff that also is not very useful. So the military-industrial complex, which produces stuff that is of no use to humankind whatsoever except to destroy, employs an enormous number of people.
Right.
And so I think one thing we're all in denial about is the fact that we keep contributing to an economy that is slowly taking us down.
Right.
And that we can't face the alternative, which is to have an actual productivity-based economy that is a lower net annual income economy, but spiritually and psychologically healthier.
And environmentally sustainable, because
more sustainable,
there's a finite amount of raw materials
That's right.
to build stuff from.
That's right.
And we pretend like it'll never run out.
Yeah.
There's another angle, another element of the American exceptionalism that I think of, this notion that we've talked about, how it's okay for us to keep making these wars, and we get concerned about what happens to the troops that come back with mental disabilities, or they come back and they commit suicide, or they beat up on their wives and kids and stuff, and so you have well-meaning politicians like Patty Murray who says, oh, let's provide some more counseling for them. That is such an epidemic. There are more people dying from suicide in the military than are being killed in the wars. And this is a public health epidemic, and if you have a public health epidemic, it's not enough just to provide treatment at the back end. You've got to do prevention at the front end.
Right.
We've got to stop having a foreign policy that relies upon killing people in other countries, and stop having a foreign policy that requires us to train our troops to dehumanize themselves and other people. You got to do that through prevention. Let's stop doing that stuff, and then we won't have as much suicide and PTSD and domestic violence at the back end of it.
May I add to that?
Please.
There's a study in Denmark that was just completed, which looked at soldiers who were deployed in Afghanistan and Iraq under NATO. And what they discovered was that those soldiers who had the least resilience to trauma were those soldiers who had the most damaged childhoods. So that when we talk about these suicides and we talk about the PTSD as a result of war, we're not factoring into the situation the fact that we live in a country that seriously deprives a lot of our children of a healthy childhood, and therefore they're not resilient as they get older. So yes, the wars are wrong, and yes, the trauma that's produced by war is terrible, but we're not even looking at what is the actual contributing factor
Yeah.
to the biggest cause of PTSD in the soldiers, which is not to do with the war at all, but to do with basically the war on the middle class.
Well,
but that's
and-
getting kind of politicized.
And budget cuts that hurt kids.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
that's a prevention thing.
Yep.
Budget cuts at the state level, at the
Yep.
federal level. Kids don't get valued, but we got to give tax breaks to the rich and for the big corporations, and put more money into military weapons and stuff, and then causing all that problem for kids who grow up and are more susceptible then to PTSD and
Sure.
and
When I went
problems.
to school as a child, there was no such thing as a breakfast program.
Right.
We now have breakfast programs for our children in school because the parents can't feed them.
They're too poor.
Children in our state
Yeah.
are going to bed hungry.
Yeah.
A lot. It's a scandal.
But-
But we,
Well, we've become used to that over the years. It's like the
Yeah.
old put the frog in
Yeah.
water and slowly turn up the heat, and the frog won't realize it's being cooked.
Right.
And I think we've been doing that these last
Excellent
few decades with whether it's homelessness or poverty or any of these things. And I think there's denial about that.
Yeah.
People need to grapple with these realistically. Arthur, you had mentioned the gap in the United States between the rich and the poor when we were talking on the phone to prepare for the show. Mention that, because I think we haven't touched on that explicitly in the show. And I have a number of things I want to have us check in on pretty briefly each. So if you could do just a...
Yeah, it's my understanding that we, certainly among the industrialized nations, that we have the greatest inequality of income, with those who have the most and the bulk of folks who have the least. And the inequality of income certainly contributes to volatility, as I understand it, in our economy. That was the greatest inequality before the Great Depression back in the 20s, 30s, and again for the Great Recession. That is another time of significant inequality. And and we have this. We're told of this, understanding that the rich are the job makers, and yet given that, there are all of these kind of what seem to be some inherent contradictions, because I agree that a consumer-based economy is not the healthiest for us in the long term, and yet within that consumer-based economy, with the well-to-do, they tend to save more of their money, whereas with those who have less tend to spend more money, and so when those who have less have more money, then more money gets infused into the economy, and the economy is healthier. Whereas when there is that inequality, that there's less money, and so those who are poor, as did happen, have to borrow more, and then again that contributes to the instability of the economy. And of course, at the same time, that means that those who have less, and so we have the need for serving breakfast at schools in the morning.
Yeah. John, you had mentioned the United States' low rank in health care, health indicators.
Yeah, right. There's a guy up at the University of Washington who has published a lot on this, and his name is Steve Bezruka. And one of the things he's pointed out is that of the 35 industrialized or nearly industrialized nations, the United States ranks 34th in life expectancy. We're at the bottom. We're below Cuba. Cubans have a higher life expectancy than Americans. The infant mortality rate in the United States is the highest of all industrialized nations. So the idea that we have this wonderful healthcare system is absolutely wrong. And what you were talking earlier about treatment as opposed to prevention, we're not putting much money into prevention
Right.
at all.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, these are like hard realities, but we don't want to look at them, or we'll find a scapegoat or some way to be in denial. When we were preparing for the program, Arthur, you mentioned the persistent racism and the high incarceration rates for African Americans in this country, and we like to believe that we're in a post-racial society. After all, we have a black president now, and so we can just ignore all that other stuff that used to be in the past and not recognize that it's the new Jim Crow now. I mean, there's just a bunch of these things that are going on, and I want us to move into solutions. You know, we've talked about problems, and it would be really nasty to just leave it there. But there are some solutions, and we've talked about one first step is to acknowledge reality, to overcome the denial about these hard realities. And one of the things that occurs to me as a remedy is to actually take a bold action on something. And I think of the work that you did in your congregation when homeless folks were camping out on the city lot in downtown Olympia, and they were there for camping out for several days, and the city of Olympia had ordered the police department to go and evict them, and your congregation stepped forward and says, well, you can camp on our property. And that was the start of a rotating system of local congregations hosting Camp Quixote. Well, there was a bold action. It sort of refused to accept the status quo. It accepted the reality that existed. You know, yes, we have homeless people. Now let's solve the problem. And it was a bold action. And that's what we need more of. And I'd love to see that in more areas of our society. How could we as a society, or as individuals, or as congregations, or nonprofit groups, or whatever, act out boldly?
Well, one of the things that I think about in terms of, you know, denial and doing things, facing things, is that people have to have hope. You know, in order to confront these things, simultaneously there has to be hope. So inherent in that action was some hope. It wasn't the hope that, oh, homelessness is going to be gone in Olympia. The hope was there is a place where you can come. And the hope was we as a community are going to address this, you know, faith communities. And so I think inherent in whatever it is that we choose to do, individuals, communities, there has to be, it can't just be, you know, how horrible everything is, but that there is hope indeed that we can do something. So I guess whatever bold action people do, I see that there's always this element of, and I don't mean hope in a campaign slogan way. I mean it in a really concrete way, that you see that the action is being taken and there's hope inherent in it. So I guess I just put in a plug for hope in that action-oriented, not in a, you know, oh, let's all hope.
And I think that hope needs to be manifested in the day-to-day. That I agree that you know, that a bold action, you know, can in fact make a difference, and you know, and galvanize and all, and is important. And yet, I know for our congregation's part of participating in, you know, and being able to take that action, it came out of ongoing action before, as I had mentioned in an earlier conversation, of one individual within the congregation who had addressed homelessness and provided a shelter with a building on our property, and then there was and that went on for some time, and then there was a larger conversation. But what I'm saying is that action that the congregation didn't just occur. It came out of a context, and it came out of the context of ongoing action. And that ongoing action is something that that many of us do, you know, that we do, and we say, oh, you know, what good is this doing? You know, I'm just doing something. You know, does it really matter? It's a Band-Aid. You know, all those things that we do to sort of belittle the little things that we do, and yet those little acts of hope from day to day are what create the environment that allows us to, when that time presents itself and the opportunity presents itself, to take a bold action.
Right. Well, and it's like Rosa Parks when she sat on the white people's part of the bus. That was not just a spontaneous thing. She had gone through nonviolence training at the Highlander Center in Tennessee. She had a long background of volunteering with the NAACP there in Montgomery. And this was a calculated strategic step. It was a bold action, but the time was right, and they had done the preparation. So all of these are a process. Another thing that comes to mind is about helping us get out of the denial and moving ahead is like in South Africa when they had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where they said, okay, let's deal with the past. Let's get this out here. Let's have testimony as to what the realities are, what really happened, and deal with it. And there may be other kinds of things that can be done, but on a issue by issue basis or community by community basis. But wouldn't it be great to have like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission process about race in this country, or some other, some serious grapplings. I want to put in a plug for, we're almost out of time, I want to put in a plug for Heart Sparkle Players that you've been active with since 1990. That you use a process called playback theater to help people tell their stories. And I've appreciated how Heart Sparkle Players helps people deal with realities, because you're helping people tell their stories of realities in their lives, including some that have deep heart connections or meaning for the lives. I just want to put in a plug for that, encourage people to attend the performances that happen one Friday evening each month, except not during the summer, and visit the website that has the schedule and other information, which is www.heartsparkle.org. So it's just a great resource. I want to thank John Van Enwick and Debbie Eden and Arthur Vaney for being our guests. I want to thank all the folks who've been watching. Thoughtful people look around and see a lot of gigantic problems, and we've enumerated a number of them, and there are some more. A lot of our political, economic, and social systems in this country are broken, and some people speak out explicitly, but many more people don't speak out and don't even want to acknowledge it, although they may sort of feel it subconsciously but not admit it. Instead, we do weird things with our psychology, like living in fantasy worlds or projecting problems onto scapegoats. A wise friend told me, either we deal with reality or reality will deal with us. And a Turkish proverb says, no matter how far you've gone down on a wrong road, turn back. That's a good message for us now. Let's turn back from denial. Let's solve the real problems. You can get information about a wide variety of problems related to peace, social justice, and nonviolence by contacting the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation at 360-491-9093 or www.olympiafor.org. We are all one human family. We all share one planet. We can create a better world, but all of us have to do our part, and the world needs what you have to offer. Thanks.